All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the last few of a set of 12 videos introducing you to basic ethical theories. This final set of 2 videos is about computer, machine, and information ethics. These aren't necessarily the same thing, but we're going to see they do ask very similar questions. Among these questions is, how will our use of computers to do work? Machines that do some work of their own, and information communication technologies, ICTs, how will these things change our human ethics? Ethics that we have learned from centuries without these devices and technologies. And another question that they have in common is this: could there be said to be an ethics that governs these technologies as such? Or in other words, as moral agents, and as the patients of our moral actions, is there an ethics that governs what computers, machines, and ICTs themselves do, and what humans can do to them? These questions are both more complicated and simpler than you think. There's lots of sci-fi out there about futuristic robots asking how they'll change us and how they'll change our society and whether we should be afraid, very afraid. And there are futurists out there talking about the coming AI singularity with apocalyptic predictions about what will happen if we don't act now. But the questions of computer, machine, and information ethics are already with us, and they have been with us since at least the moment of widespread adoption of the personal computer in the 1980s. So we want to look back a little bit, and we want to look at our present day to see what questions we already do have about these technologies. So let's forget for a moment about our robot overlords of the future, and let's think about the complications in how we interact with technology we already have all around us. Now, you'll recall that in our second set of videos for this course, which was about deontology, we encountered a question about lying. Let me remind you about it for a second. In Kant's famous example, he says you have a duty not to lie, even to a murderer who's at your door, for various different reasons. Among these reasons that he gives are that, as a moral agent, you have a duty to act from pure goodwill. Another of the reasons is that the murderer is a free and rational agent whose actions you're not responsible for if you do act from goodwill alone. And among the other reasons that he gives are that, in the most universal formulation of the argument, you cannot will the maxim of this action, lie, when doing so will produce some better results, without willing a contradiction. You'll remember he says the very notion of truth-telling implies an overall system in which all free and rational agents can rely upon each other's words, so it would be impossible to will both tell the truth and lie sometimes to produce some better result at the same time. It'd be a contradiction. Now, imagine a member of the incoming freshman class asked an online chatbot that had been created in our COAST department. Let's call it, hypothetically, Tiger Preview. She asks it whether she should exit the university grounds through Fitz-Randolph Gate. Now, Tiger Preview was designed as sort of an FAQ for pre-frosh, who have a million anxious questions and nobody to give answers to them. So the bot in this case gives the pre-frosh this answer. It says to her, you should never exit through Fitz-Randolph Gate, or you won't graduate with your Princeton class, if at all. And it tells her, let's say, the story of somebody in the class of 1972 who tried it one time after an eating club party and later lived to regret it. Now, let's say the Tiger Preview bot did as it was programmed. It scoured the web and it found tons of stories about Fitz-Randolph Gate. Now, sure, most of those stories were prefaced with legend has it, but look, so many things on the internet are prefaced with these words that the bot knew that these words weren't integral to this story. They were a part of a lot of stories. And the bot also found references to that unfortunate 1972 non-graduate, and they were stated in the most factual of languages on lots of different sites. So did Tiger Preview lie? To lie, we ordinarily think, requires an intentional agent who understands a piece of information to be untruthful, or at least to be less than complete, but gives that piece of information to another in a manner that's meant to convince them that it is true information. And that's a lie whether or not giving that information is for the good of the recipient or not. But can a non-intentional entity like Tiger Preview lie? Or let's say that it ends up being not just this one prefrosh who believes Tiger Preview, but a whole incoming class and future incoming classes as well. They come to think of the Fitz-Randolph Gates story not as you do, as sort of a fun college myth, but they come to think of it as the ground truth. They pass it around amongst each other, and if anyone needs to check the truth of it, they have Tiger Preview there to search for themselves. Did Tiger Preview wrong this sort of mysterious entity, future Princeton classes? That's not our first question. Our first question was a question of whether or not the bot can lie. That's a question of the bot as an agent. This second question is who a lie can even wrong. Who's the moral patient of that action? Some collective entity? Can a collective entity be wronged? Now, a Kantian might say a lie wrongs an intentional agent if it causes that agent to rely on a falsehood, because then they can't make their own choices. But the collective group, future tigers, isn't an autonomous agent in the same sense as a person. And it's unclear that if they believe this information, they are any worse off in their agentic decision-making than any of you are, who, look, when push comes to shove, probably avoid exiting through Fitz-Randolph Gate anyway, just to be safe. Maybe their beliefs or their information environment have changed on them, but their choices haven't. But still, we might think that we don't want to create agents like Tiger Preview, agents that aren't quite ready to handle the truth like human agents are. Even if we don't think they can lie, we might think we don't want to create agents like that. And we might think that it's important, here and now, not to contribute to the creation of a future collectivity that has those false beliefs about the world. So we might be thinking that a wrong had been done, even though there wasn't an agent there to do it, and we might think that somebody had been wronged, even though there wasn't the right type of agent there to receive that wrong. So chatbots may leave us with both of these types of questions. First, a set of questions about moral agents. Are the algorithms themselves moral agents, which we can judge for having wronged others? Or are the programmers the moral agents who we can judge? And what's the judgment we're making, and about whom are we making it? And then the second set of questions again, who are the moral patients of these wrong acts if it's not individuals? What people believe to be true in that future Princeton will have changed in some way, but it's unclear whether at that time, given the new belief in particular, there's really been any effect on undermining the autonomous choice of any future moral patient. Maybe the most difficult question to ask is the question of who's responsible when the very basic meanings and purposes of a social activity, the information and beliefs we have about it, are changed by a technology. Now, our Tiger Preview example might seem trivial. The bot changed a myth into a somewhat more serious belief, but we know that repeated exposure to seemingly true misinformation on social media can end up convincing people that there are equally far-fetched forces at work in their world, forces at work manipulating the powers that be in the U.S. government, or dark hidden forces at work in some U.S. allies that make them really enemies, or some U.S. enemies that make them really allies. To change our perception of the truth is to change our ethics in response to our perceived truth. So, maybe the most important, largest scale ethical question we can ask is what responsibilities exist, and for whom they exist, for creating a truthful informational environment. I'm going to call that difficult ethical conundrum the question of information ethics. That's going to form a subtext in this first video, and it's going to be the entirety of the second video when we're going to look at Luciano Floridi's The Ethics of Information. But our first question in this video is whether we can program computers or machines themselves to be ethical, either in the sense of making the decisions that we would judge ethical from our own ethical logic, according to whichever theory we endorse, or in the sense of actually being able to execute ethical logic themselves. That is, in a sense, to think precisely what a truly ethical person would think and to decide an ethical issue based on that reason-giving within. These are the questions about whether we can make these technologies into responsible ethical agents themselves. Now, really, these questions started to be asked in earnest before we all had supercomputers in our pockets, or before the internet was on every device, and before artificial intelligence was anything more than a dream. In the 1980s, and even before that, people were asking what it would mean when computers were part of everyday human life, when machines became autonomous, and when information became ubiquitous, in a sense. So we're going to focus for a bit on these questions, ones that I think are less urgent, however much sci-fi covers these questions. But we'll see at the end of this video that the larger question, the question of responsibility for the information environment itself, emerges from these perhaps smaller questions of engineering ethical agents. All the way back in 1985, James Moore wrote an article entitled "What is Computer Ethics?" You'll find it on Canvas. I recommend that you take a look at it because it's pretty amazing how he foretells the very questions that we're asking in the 2020s. On 271 to 272, for instance, he says computers, and again, this is pre-internet, pre-AI, he says computers will transform the very purposes of all human activities and institutions. For instance, he predicts that we, you and I, will be asking about work and about education. We'll be asking what the nature and value of such activities are. And we've seen in our own time schools having to clarify the purposes of assignments now that chatbots can actually write them for students. He also says we'll have to rethink what money is once it's just numbers on a screen. And with the rise and fall of cryptocurrencies, we've seen society thinking through that very question in real time. I think Moore is even more prescient on how computer technologies might change not just our practices, but our values themselves. On 273 to 274, for instance, he talks about what he calls invisible programming values. With that, he means that in order to specify some variables that lie behind the logic of a program, a programmer is going to have to, he says, make some value judgments about what is important and what is not. But these value judgments may be hidden from the end user in some ways. So the example that he uses, even back in 1985, is electronic pricing for flights, something that we read articles about almost every day today. He suggests that a flight search algorithm could suggest to you the flights of a particular company on the assumption that you value that brand or certain qualities that it stands for, but that it could suggest those flights to you rather than show you the cheapest or the shortest or the most comfortable flight. Whether it chooses to prioritize brand value or price or duration or comfort is itself a value choice. And the problem may not be that you as a user are being manipulated by the conscious value choices of a programmer, but perhaps the problem is more insidious, that no one ever really considered the implicit assumptions behind the value choices they programmed into those search parameters. Yet, in response, the entire social process, in this case flight booking, changes without anyone consciously in charge of it. Programmers thought they were simply applying a neutral new technology to a static social process, but they ended up changing the very meaning of that process by the implicit value choices that they, as programmers, made. So you see what I mean here. The larger question of responsibility for changing the information and the ethical environment was already starting to emerge in 1985 even, from that smaller question of what it meant to program ethical value choices into computers. I think those questions emerge even more sharply for Moore 20 years later in the 2006 article that's on Canvas, which is called "The Nature, Importance, and Difficulty of Machine Ethics." By then, 2006, Moore was starting to think more of computers as machines. Or in other words, more than processing information, they were beginning to make and to execute decisions. So the machine ethics article is known for differentiating between what he calls implicit ethical agents, explicit ethical agents, and full ethical agents. But it's also famous for a fourth category, what he calls ethical impact agents. He may be treating that as the least important category in the article, but I'm going to suggest to you it's the most important. By going through the first three categories briefly, then I'm going to suggest to you how the fourth one emerges from them and how it's really the question that ought to preoccupy us today and will occupy us in our second video. As an example of the first category, an implicit ethical agent, he uses an ATM. You can't tell it to be honest, that's an explicit value. But you can program it to double-check the amount of money it dispenses to users, and people will now interact with it as an honest broker, but honesty is simply implicit as a value in what it does. And you might even include a limit on how much money a user is able to take out in a day as a sort of implicit check on the user. There could be a couple reasons for that. It's either to protect them from the danger that an identity thief would get their ATM card and PIN and sort of clean out their bank account, or maybe you're even protecting them from themselves so that in a moment of weakness they don't spend their entire savings just on a whim. But those values, again, would simply be implicit in the programmed withdrawal limit. What Moore then calls an explicit ethical agent is something else. In an explicit ethical agent, the programmer does program in certain ethical criteria, like IBM programmed the rules of chess into its computer Deep Blue. So maybe they give it certain duties to adhere to by stating things it has permission to do and to not do, or by stating obligations of what it should do and not do. But what the programmer is then trying to do, as Moore describes it on page 20, is to describe ethical situations with sufficient precision to make ethical judgments by machine. Again, explicit ethics is guiding that. Now, in either of these situations, where the programmer creates an implicit ethical agent or an explicit ethical agent, it seems clear that the programmer can be held responsible for any ethical wrongs that the machine does. For the implicit ethical agent, the programmers gave it functions. They gave it the functions that they gave it, and they could reasonably foresee that it was going to fulfill or sort of violate some value. And in fact, a decision tree of the possibilities is part of the architecture of that machine. And in the case of an explicit ethical agent, the programmers gave it the rules that they gave it. So the behavior of the machine is going to be traceable to those programming choices. Sure, the specific behavior may be unpredictable in some ways. The machine's going to respond to the situations that it's put into, and those situations may themselves be unforeseen. That, after all, is the point of the machine. It's flexible and adaptable, but its behaviors are nevertheless, at least in principle, traceable to the design choices. And so, responsibility for those choices can be assigned to the programmer or designer. But the same can't be said of a full ethical agent. A full ethical agent can make autonomous ethical judgments, and as Moore says about it on page 20, it's competent to reasonably justify them. That problem you can see about full ethical agents is the problem of whether or not they can even engage in wrongdoing. They are not adult humans with consciousness, intentionality, and free will. So can they be held responsible for their actions? But okay, here's a bigger problem that I want to leave you with until we pick it up again in our second video. Ultimately, it's the same problem as with our Tiger Preview bot from before. What if we program an agent, implicitly, explicitly, or fully ethical, that then changes our ethical environment for us in some way? What if it makes new ethical possibilities salient, or maybe even creates new ethical values? That may be, in principle, unforeseeable. Moore calls these ethical impact agents. Some of them make new ethical possibilities salient. That's like his example of robotic camel jockeys, the use of which saved countless Sudanese boys from being enslaved in Qatar as human camel jockeys. But some of them create new ethical wrongs and rights. So think about digitized finance technologies here. In a sense, They both created the wrong of identity theft, and they gave us security tools to address it. Without this ethical impact, perhaps the wrongs wouldn't exist, or at least not exist in their current form. So, do we praise ICTs that address these new wrongs? Or do we blame them for creating the wrong to begin with? The narrower set of questions is, what do we do if that ICT itself is the full agent of the wrong? Does it make sense to praise or blame ICTs as actors? But this broader question, and I'm going to say the more important question, is what do we do when they change our entire context of information, change our entire context of ethical decision making? That is the question of information ethics, and that's what we're going to take up in our next video.